Welcome back. I'm John, and today we'll be looking at the process of how I made my gauntlets for my mid-14th century suit of armor, or impression. These gauntlets are modeled after the ones found at the site of the Battle of Visby. They date to the 1340s, though clearly they saw use in 1361 during the battle itself. These gauntlets sport what is commonly called a brigandine-style construction, which that means in this case that's several smaller pieces of steel or iron, in this case steel, riveted to a foundation material, which is in this case leather. The construction of these gauntlets is a little bit unlike many others in that each finger bone, there is not just one piece of metal, but there are several overlapping ones. That makes the process very tedious, but the smaller pieces of metal would have been easier to create in the mid-14th century, rather than slightly larger ones. So the first thing I did was to cut strips of 16-gauge steel, which is about 1.5 millimeters, roughly. Mine measured to just shy of a centimeter wide, although that measurement will be different depending on your finger. Speaking of which, I think it's worth mentioning that the original wearer of the original gauntlets must have had larger fingers than me, because I used fewer lames in most of the fingers than there were in the original, which just served to shorten the fingers a little bit and fit mine better, which, after all, that's the important part, is that the gauntlets fit my hands. Then I marked out each finger lane on the strips of steel, but not cutting them just yet, because first I punched 2 holes in each lane that would for the rivets to hold it for the foundation leather. Once that was over, I used hand shears to cut all of the lames, so that now I have a whole bunch of little steel rectangles with 2 holes each. Each of them was about 2 centimeters long, 1 centimeter wide, but again, that would change depending on your hand size. Then I used a divot in my vise and a hammer with a long sort of head to curve each finger lane so that it fit my finger. The next thing were the knuckle pieces. Now, I'd like to note that after using these gauntlets for a few months, the knuckles would have benefited from being a deeper shape. Indeed, that's how they are on the original. So, let that serve as a lesson to all of us, to follow the originals closely. To shape the knuckle pieces, I first used the acute side of a ball peen hammer and a stump with divots beaten into it to dish each piece. Then I used a ball stake to push the corners down. In hindsight, I would have benefited from using a smaller stake, but I don't know. I used what I had at the moment. Next up is riveting the plates to the foundational leather. Usually I would use roofing nails for something like this, but I found out quickly that the heads on those were too large and they would overlap each other too much. So I put the shank of the nail into an electric drill and spun the heads to a smaller size with the help of a bench grinder. This way, when I began riveting them into the leather, the rivet heads wouldn't touch and mess things up. It would also look a lot sharper. Then I used a marker to mark out where each hole on the finger lane lined up with the leather. Then I would use an awl to poke the holes. Put the rivet through the leather, then the finger lane, and then I peened the rivet over like normal. So something to note when peening rivets, it's important to use the small side of the hammer and hammer the edges of the rivet shank in concentric circles so that it begins to mushroom over. Then I trimmed the edges of the leather to conform more to the shape of the finger. But remember to leave a little extra leather on the sides though, because that's how the fingers will be attached to the gloves later on. And then I do that process to each finger. Now comes the back of the hand. I did this a little bit differently than the finger lames, but I did still begin the same by cutting out strips of steel to save time. Then I trimmed them down to the correct length. And then, only after that, when I was satisfied with the length of each one, did I punch the holes in the strip, into these little strips. For the foundation leather on the back of the hand, I started with a very basic, very shallow U shape that would be refined and trimmed later on. I used vegetable tan leather for this, and a homemade dye comprised of vinegar and rusty nails that dyed the leather black very quickly. I'm going to make a little note of that later at the end of the video, so stick around for that. Then I shaped the plates in a similar way to the finger lames. Then I riveted them to a foundation leather just like the fingers beforehand. Once all of these back of the hand plates, or metacarpal plates, were in place, I individually marked where each finger would rest, using my own hand as a guide. I then used a stout thread to sew the fingers onto the metacarpal piece in the orientation that I set up. This required the use of a special leather needle and needle nose pliers to penetrate the tough leather, which, as you can see, I marked out each finger, which finger was which, with a very complicated code. Now for the fun part, the knuckle plate. First of all, I drew out the basic shape on a piece of cardboard for a pattern, and then I used my hand as a guide for where each knuckle protrusion should be placed. Similarly to the way that I shaped the finger knuckle pieces, I used the small side of a hammer to rough out the shape, then a stake with a small head to make the more refined and distinguished knuckle shape. I then punched holes around the perimeter of the knuckle plate and riveted it to the metal cardboard plate and the fingers. For the base of the thumb, I followed a similar process to the knuckle plate, that is, using the small side of a hammer, and I experimented with articulated construction, which is how I interpreted the original, on the thumb itself. The fingers of the gauntlet were sewn to the leather gloves and using a sort of spiral stitch that is easily repairable and replaceable and holds it on very well. All you need to do is put the leather through one side, through the glove, and through the foundational leather, pull it through, and then put the needle through the same side again, and just repeat that, like so. As for the cuffs, the original had no associated cuff, but mine went through several stages, because I appreciated a little bit of wrist protection, and you can see some sort of cuff in lots of artwork. So the first cuffs that I used were given to me as a gift from our good friend Teutonic Penguin, but I grew less fond of these as time went on and eventually replaced them with solid plate cuffs that were based off of these pair of dissociated cuffs of the same time period, as the solid plate ones offered me more protection than the other ones. So after using these for several months, or 7 months actually exactly, I am still very happy with them, since they've seen a lot of use, as I've been attending a HEMA club almost twice a week and using them for sparring during that. They've held up surprisingly well for the, frankly, embarrassing number of times I get hit on the hands, and I think that if I were to do this again, I would probably use a different leather, as I've heard that vegetable tanned leather can become brittle if dyed in the method that I used. Indeed, around the edges there have been several rivets that have torn out, but I don't believe that was as much from the leather as it was from my poor rivet placement, which has since been fixed and I haven't had any problems since then. Another thing I would like to improve on if I did this again would be to make the knuckle pieces deeper to allow more room for my knuckles. Despite these two minor inconveniences, these gauntlets have served me remarkably well, protecting my hands from brutal blows that would have otherwise left me screaming with shattered fingers, while at the same time granting me excellent mobility. Thank you for watching.